Hello there, Gary Garrett's here. I'm going to be doing a gouache demo here focusing on upping your painting game with a lesson on several nice techniques combining color mixing, complementary colors, and especially layering warm and cool colors with a highlight on painting textures. Before we start out, I want to show you my color palette and the container that it fits in. You'll be referring to this several times during the demo, and I put that list in there just so you can keep track of as I go through my color mixing. A couple of points to keep in mind as we get moving here. First, the real-time painting has been doubled in speed on this video. And the second, throughout the demo, various sections of the reference photos will show up for comparisons. Keep an eye out for them. Normally I mix up a pretty big pool of blues for my sky, but this sky is going to be pretty patchy and very cloudy with a lot of value differences. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to mix up a little bit of turquoise blue and some white, and then kind of hit the perimeter of it just for the blue sky part. The sky color I knocked in is still pretty wet, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a little bit more of some smalt blue and then kind of float it in on the inside of that to see what'll happen. When I paint my skies, I generally do them in one pass, and so what I just did there is I took that blue and mixed in a little bit of burnt sienna with it. Gives it a warm cast. Since it's a complement, it makes some really nice grays. And again, if you can notice, I'm like being very careful about using the whites of the paper and leave that more jagged white section next to the sky, so it gives it a really nice sort of contrast. You might notice that I'm going into that pool of blue and kind of reinvigorating it, refilling it, and then coming back in over the top of it with the burnt umber or even some burnt sienna. And then when I do that, I tilt it more towards the cool colors, which is what I'm doing right now. But in the upper part of the clouds, you can see it has more of a warm bent. Now, that has to do with light bouncing off the ground, sometimes the sun effects coming through the clouds, but it gives a nice effect. You can see I'm doing it right there, where there's a gray mixture with a little bit of that brown in it. Now, as I lay in that orange, it might look a little bit too intense, but one thing that's going to happen is since the mixture around is wet, it's going to sort of bleed into that orange and knock it back a little bit more. As the photo comes up, you can see I'm using it more for inspiration rather than copying it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the trees. And I'm going to put a mixture of Windsor green down first and kind of block it in. You'll see when the photograph comes up that I'm not copying the tree, is that I'm designing it. I'm designing it to make my composition better, not trying to identify what kind of tree it is. Mixing in there a little bit of a pale cadmium green there, and then once again it's kind of wet on wet, so it mixes. And this is the beauty that I like about gouache, is that you can go right over the top of painting that you already have already. And once again, if you look at the tree that I'm putting in here right now, it looks very little like the tree that was actually there. I'm laying it in more as to help silhouette the buildings than I am add the trees in. Having said that, though, I did make sure that I kept the shapes of the tree as much as possible and made them interesting to once again help the composition. Keep in mind, though, this is just the blocking in the first pass on this, and I'll certainly be coming in back to the trees and bumping up the shadows and adding more texture and identification and interest to them. I blocked in the roof colors using sort of a combination of blues and oranges, sort of battling between the sky dome color that's falling on top of the roofs and the actual red tiles that are there. And once again, I'll be revisiting that because I think they're a little bit too much on the dark side. So as I'm going in and mixing, you can see I start out with that sky dome color, that purple, and then I come back in with blues and oranges. So I'm sort of doing this battle right now between the warms and the cools on that stucco on the side of the upper parts of the buildings. And by mixing the blues and the oranges, I'm getting a neutral, but it looks like I'm tilting it a little bit more towards the greenish aspect of it. And then adding just a little bit more purple and then back to the orange. Like, this is my first pass, so this is basically just blocking everything in and waiting for the shadow pattern and the texture patterns in the future. The values between the warms and the cools I'm using are not that high contrast, so there's a real good mixing going on that may not be evident from what you're seeing right now, but there's this kind of battle in between the cools and the warms, and that's what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait until after it all dries and becomes more opaque. That way in the next pass I can see whether I just need a simple glaze over the top of it will show the underpainting, or whether I have to go very, very thick and impasto and completely obliterate what I've already done. So what I really like about gouache is it gives you so many options to pull from, all the way from very, very thin, watery mixtures to thick impasto, almost like oil paint. Now I'm going to jump down to the brick part of the building here, and that purple that I used for the shadows on the top of those roofs there is I mix that in with an orange for the darker area, and then I'm coming off to the side with more of a pure mixture. Decided that was a little bit too much intense, and then mix a little bit of white in it. And you can see that even though you can see the difference in the values, they're still about the same range, so they're not really jarring. I'm trying to get sort of a harmonization of the entire painting first before I start going in and jumping in for a lot of details. Though I am planning for that. As you can see, I'm sort of blocking in around the windows at this part. So I have the advantage of actually have painted at this site in Italy. So I know that this section of the building has more of a sunlit area. So I mixed up some primary yellow along with that orange. I'm coming back in here and knocking that back a little bit by mixing a little bit of brown in there and even a little bit of blue, just to kind of desaturate it a little bit, bring it in with the other pieces. But once again, this is an underpainting, so I'll certainly be going over a lot of sections of this with ideas of different textures and different lighting. Right now I'm countering that sunlit part of the building and mixed in some burnt sienna in with that sky blue color for the shadowed areas. It gives you a nice warm but dark contrast to the sunlit part of the cliff. Okay, so now I want to anchor the lower portion of the composition and the buildings. So I take a little bit of white and go up to that brown and blue mixture up there, and I tilt it just a little bit more towards the orange, just a little bit towards the warmer. But then I shift it over a little bit more using a little bit more blue because you have that shadow pattern back underneath that tree that I'll be putting in there. So what happens is that you get a cool and warm mixture in there. And this is the underpainting. And one thing I'm making sure of as I do this is really focus in on the shape design. So I have this balance I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to paint fast, considering again this is representing a plein air painting, but I still have to make sure I keep the somewhat vertical edges on the buildings and make sure they're somewhat precise, because again, I don't want these buildings looking like they're falling over or architecturally sloppy, right? Even though they're hand built, hundreds of years ago, I still have to keep that integrity inside of the design. So if you check out the photograph, you see this is a somewhat ambivalent area here. So I'm using wet on wet techniques and building in a series of cool and warm planes in here. Again, it's an underpainting, so I'll be able to go back in it later and sort of spruce it up a bit. Moving on to the left-hand side of the cliff, one thing I can see is that that volcanic rock there is pretty neutral. So even though I'm starting up with this fairly intense saturated area there, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to use that pool of color in the upper left, again the browns and the blues there, but make it fairly neutral. One of the reasons for it is that I am going to be going over the top later of it. See, again, this is the nice thing about the blocking in part, is you have enough time to kind of think your way through this. So I'm making it neutral because I'm going to be painting textures and foliage over the top of it. But having said that, I'm going to put down this sort of diffused red here because the green for the tree that I'm going to put in later will be the complement of it, and it'll sort of shine a little bit more and sort of anchor that part of the composition. Right now, I'm just going to suggest the roofs of the houses below. I don't want to bring a lot of attention to them, but I do want to put sort of a little bit more of a spritey color on it, just so they brighten up a little bit. Also, by adding the roofs, it adds a sense of scale and verticality to the cliffs above it. You might even notice that my iron brush continually sort of goes throughout the composition to pull it together. I'm trying to harmonize the underpainting so I get a good idea of the entire structure of it and the value system before I go in with the next layer of shadows and textures. I'm really engaged in that dance between the value and color systems of the painting. Once again, I want to harmonize it and keep it together before I start to switch and build up a series of darks and highlights. So I have this little shadowed piece of the wall back here, so I mix some ultramarine blue and some burnt umber in here, and then just sort of wash it in there to see what happens. You notice I don't do it on a real primary place right in the middle. I kind of lay it off to the side to see how it comes out before I commit to darker areas later. In tackling that lower right-hand section of the painting, which I'm going to be laying the roofs in, I realize that there's going to be a lot of foliage there. So what I'm going to do is pick up some of that pink opera color and lay it in there, knowing that the greens over the top of it later on, and it being the complement, will sort of juice up that corner a little bit more. Once again, it looks really colorful right now, but I also know that I'm going to be putting tiles and shadows over the top of that, so it'll knock the color back a little bit. So at this point, I'm going to mix in a little bit of primary yellow with a little bit of that cadmium green pale, and then go back into the trees a bit. And once again, this is one of the advantages of gouache. Even though you've painted over this already, the opaque qualities of the gouache will go over previous areas that you've painted. It won't be as pure as going on the white paper, but it means that you can also constantly sort of reshift and reimagine the shapes of your forms right there. I'm using flat brushes throughout this painting, and one of the nice things I like about the well there, where the colors are, is the fact that they stay fairly moist, so you don't have to crush the brush into it. You can just sort of lay it in and pick color up. And as I'm mixing right now, I'm using Windsor green, ultramarine blue, and then even a little bit of burnt umber and flame red to sort of hit the complement there and darken up the solution a bit for the undersides of the tree. This is much better than using black because you get a much more sophisticated use of color and arrangement of color back underneath between warms and cools. At this point, I'm shifting the color palette a little bit because the trees in the back are pine trees, and the ones I'm painting right now are olive trees, a little bit more drab. I'm using a terra verde, white, and a little bit of yellow ochre as I put them together, and then building them up. You can even notice the strokes are a little bit different, a little bit more athletic, so to speak, in these. Putting those green trees next to that red section of paint right next to it creates a simultaneous contrast. And even though I know that I'll be going to the future and laying over textures and shadows over the top of it, I like to work with a little bit more saturated colors at the beginning to see what happens. Okay, so now I got about 90% of the painting blocked in. I'm going to lay in a little bit of blue color for the shades, and then mix in some Prussian blue and some burnt umber and get a nice dark out of that, using that flat brush there to just sort of gently knock the windows in. Once again, I want to keep them loose enough where it fits the rest of the painting, but I definitely want to make sure I also keep the shape and the scale. So if you notice, like as I put those windows in, it's very much the idea of, say, a regular sized person being in those buildings. It's not erratic placement. Now that I got a good painting rhythm all set up here, and I'm adding these last little parts of the windows and doors in the back here, is that now I'm going to take those larger forms and start to break them down a little bit. So even adding little chimneys, little windows there. But now I'm going to build up the colors a little bit more and add some glazing, some layers, so that I just put a nice cool gray right over the top of that warm color that was there before. And that warm color sort of shines through because the glaze is a thinner mixture of paint. There you can see I'm laying down even a more intense red over the top of that vertically, once again enhancing the vertical part of the building. One important point you might notice is that when I put the paint on, a lot of times it looks really dark, but as it dries, it'll dry right back into the matrix of the rest of the painting. The more you experiment with what gouache does, you'll learn how its properties will work in a painting. Rather than freaking out at the paint you put down at the moment, it's obviously going to change one way or the other. Like take, for instance, the way I'm painting the roof. I keep adding white to it, hoping that it gets a little bit higher, but I know that the limitation is that it's going to stay that value, so I'll go over with some darker areas later. I'm doing the same thing down there below, where originally it was a warm color, and now I'm adding some sort of like more light, cool concrete color over the top of it. Yet that little bit of that red still shines through the paint. You might even notice that I use a more impasto, very thick paint in some areas of it, like I'm doing right here. But in other areas, my brushwork, I'll thin it out and then I'll run the brush very quickly over the top of the paint. It creates a dry brush effect, and the paint actually becomes thinner and doesn't affect the layers underneath as much. It's like a glazing technique. So I made this dark mixture here for shadows and on the inside of the walls, on the inside of the windows, and then underneath the rock formations that go down the cliff. And as I do that, a lot of times it's maybe a little bit harder to see, but there's actually strokes of different colors within the same brush stroke. It's called marbling. And so now, this is again knowing the properties of gouache. I'm coming over the top of it and going dark over light. But that foliage on the left that I put in, I'm automatically knowing I'm making that darker because I'm going to be coming in with a thicker, lighter paint later on and going over the top of it so it shines a little bit more. So once again, there's a value contrast. Using a fan brush now to lay in the flame red with a little bit of the schmaltz blue on there for this shadow color. And I love the fan brush here because it's more of a bristly brush and it gives you more of a separation of the bristles when you're painting. A little bit more of a texture look to it, especially for stone and rougher surfaces. Now I'm really punching up the textures on the side of the rocks, the brick and the stone on the side of the buildings here. Still reinforcing a little bit of the shadows, as you can see there on the side of it, but using that fan brush over the top, you can see I'm mixing some oranges with blues and then coming in with sort of a combination of warm and cool strokes there. But then if I need something like really thick, I can go right into the well of that wet color and pick up a lot of that and spread it over the top to give it more of a lighter appearance. That's what I'm doing right now. Is it got a little bit too dull for me, and so what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit more bounce light. Give it a little bit more sense of real life color and lighting. One important part that you might notice at this point is that I've broken the larger shapes into these smaller shapes, but the values aren't that contrasty. They're not really hardcore. So what happens is the whole shape holds together. All the form and the recognizable sense of the building holds together at this point. I made a solution of that opera pink paint, some thin and thick ones here. And so you might notice I'm taking that fan brush and I'm laying on a pretty liberal amount in some of the areas. Once again, to sort of dry brush up, like there you can see on the top of the roof, and pick up a little bit more texture. Even here, that looks really light at this point, but I know that eventually when it dries, it's just going to be a slight hint of a red color over the top of the green colors that are next to it. It's time to pound in a little bit more information here. So I mixed up linsum crimson with a little bit of ultramarine blue and perhaps just even a little bit of Prussian blue, which is a real kind of garbagey dark color, but I like it. And so I'm putting in these like little aspects of a little bit more of the building forms. Now the danger with this is that's a pretty dark color, so I have to keep that sort of regulated in there. And you might even notice that I mix a little bit of orange in with it, a little bit of white at the edge of that to kick up the contrast a bit more. So a lot of times what I'll do, as you can see there, is I'll paint a dark color and then I'll come over with a light one over the top of it. So I can get either a better edge or I can get a better paint mixture. Even there I add a little bit of white to the top of that to make it look like there's tiles coming out of the roof a little bit more. One of the dangers, though, on using too much line on a painting, though, is it's going to end up looking more like a coloring book, and the colors are going to disappear because the line work will be too intrusive. So as you're doing this, one of the things you might even notice what I'm doing with the lines I'm putting in, those little shadow lines, is that now I've shifted over to this dagger brush here. One side of the line it may be sharp, but the other side I sort of drag the edge of the brush down and dissipates a little bit more using sort of a dry brush effect. That way it's not going to be overly heavy, like I said, like a coloring book. What I'm shooting for is more of a painting about light and planes and blocks of value and color. And if I put line in it, it's just most of the time just to hit more architectural pieces of information and hint at value differences and edges, but not have it overwhelm the composition. A little trick I'm going to do right now is These windows are cut out of stone. And so when you cut the windows out, what it does is it leaves a little frame around the framing of the window. And so I'm taking that white paint with a little bit of orange and it's sort of knocking in that little lighter frame around it. It gives what happens that way is that it gives a little bit of a passageway from the window to the wall. And then that way the eye is a little bit more rested rather than the windows popping right out of the wall. It's a good method to be able to get the eye to transition from texture to texture or texture to color or value or whatever what the objective is. It just gives it a little bit more rest and a little bit more of ability not to see high contrast all the time. Here's that technique in use. Hopefully you can see the subtlety around the windows and the edge of the buildings where that color and value shift is. Once again, I'm using that simultaneous contrast of playing off warm and cool colors against one another. Now comes the tricky part where I'm going to start to really put the building materials, the texture, reinforce the shadows and such. And as you look at that wall is completely covered with bricks. And I do want to add a little bit of the idea of the texture, but not too much. So I'm just going to take a little bit of the shadowed area underneath the bricks, a little bit of the tile roofs here, and maybe perhaps you can see that I'm really changing up the speed of the brushwork too. It's pretty much just a burnt umber mixed in with ultramarine blue for this section of it. But sometimes you might notice that the strokes are very thin and very quick, and other times they're slow and laborious, where once again I get a little bit more of a dry brush effect to it. You can use dry brushing for all sorts of effects, like the texture of leaves and trees, concrete, rocks. The most important part is it gives your painting a little bit more of a sophisticated look and makes it more interesting to look at. You might notice the tile on the roof is that essentially the darker marks are the shadow lines, but they go all the way from long strokes to very short strokes. And so as I build up these texture lines that I'm putting on, it's more of a rhythm rather than stopping and overthinking about it. It's more like a chess game that hopefully I'm like one or two ideas and thoughts ahead of time, rather than having to kind of jump from solution to solution, which makes your painting look rather static. I want those tree trunks and branches to look alive, so I mixed a little bit of flame red in with that darker solution that I made before, and paint a support structure for the tree, rather than copying it or overdoing it and painting too many of the branches. The idea is it supports it like the stem and spines of an umbrella. It has just enough information that the eye sees it and believes it, but doesn't get stuck on it, counting the branches rather than the eye moving through the entire composition. And I put a lot of attention on the upper part of the composition, and now it's a chance to move down to the lower portion. And there's not any specific sort of technique or overall arching thing I'm doing right now. I'm sort of jumping around and putting more foliage in. Sometimes, as you can see right there, knocking down the edge of something, making it a little bit softer. And then as I go through here, I'll be throwing in the textures for the top of the tiles and on the lower portions of the building and building up the branches there, but no one central thing. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut up for a little bit and you can watch me paint. Okay, so I'm back here now. And so one of the things that happens when I paint is I love painting things, right? Windows, doors, trees, stuff, right? The strength is that I can paint those things. The weakness is that if I end up painting too much of the objects, the whole composition gets ruined and falls into pieces. So one of the things I'm doing here at the end is, in a sense, going back in and finding the core back in the composition and pulling all the pieces together. Normally for me, that means that I go in with a larger wet brush and obliterate a lot of the textures and information I put down. On this one, it actually is kind of the opposite of moving the textures around so they're sort of evenly distributed. For me, that's going back and reinforcing the composition. You can let a lot of the objects go a little bit more because the viewer will be able to figure out whether it's a tree or a building or a sky and not overly illustrate it. Last step here is to pull the painting tape off and see the crisp edges of it. And normally what I'll do, even at this point, is put the painting down for at least 15-20 minutes and give it a little rest, then come back in and maybe brighten up some areas and still do some stuff even away from either the actual place or the photographic reference. I even did it in this one, but you can't see it because I did it after the video was finished. So because this video is focused on gouache painting and plein air painting, I'm going to drop in a slide here of what my plein air gear equipment looks like out in the field. So in closing, I'd like to thank everybody for watching the video. And as this slide comes up, there's a lot more work at Instagram that you're more than welcome to go take a look at. But please leave questions if you have them. And subscribe. There's a lot more tutorial videos in this and travel logs. And I'd like to thank you guys once again for sitting around and watching this thing. And goodbye. Adios, folks.